to this videocast from Australian Community Futures Planning on the State of Australia in 2020. I'm Bronwyn Kelly, the founder of ACFP, and this series covers the facts about the health and well-being of Australia's society, environment, economy and democracy. The issues listed here are among the most important for Australia to solve before 2030. Failure to make substantial progress on these issues in the coming decade will make it harder and far more costly for Australians to arrive safely in 2050 with an acceptable degree of well-being and security. Australian Community Futures Planning is working with Australians to develop a plan to overcome the challenging issues raised in this series. That plan is called Australia Together. This is Australia's first National Community Futures Plan. It is being developed by Australians for Australians and is designed to increase our chances of arriving safely at our preferred future by 2050 or sooner. Factual details and data presented in this series provide the starting points for Australia Together. They pinpoint some of our biggest weaknesses as a nation in 2020. As such, they form the basis for some of the most ambitious targets that Australians can draft into their first National Community Futures Plan. The full set of 7 videocasts on the State of Australia in 2020 covers facts about our nation's health and well-being in 20 critical areas of our society, environment, economy and democracy. This episode covers Issue 12 on the decline of Australia's economy, Issue 13 on the loss of ownership by Australians of public assets and services, and Issue 14 on our inertia in transitioning to a new decarbonised economy. You can pause this video at any time to consider the points and statistics provided. For the remaining episodes in the State of Australia in 2020, visit the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au. To participate in integrated planning on these and other issues affecting Australia's future, subscribe for updates on the Australian Community Futures Planning website. In today's forums for economic debate, there are 2 schools of thought about economic growth, or growth of gross domestic product, or GDP. One school says GDP isn't a good measure of a nation's wealth and well-being, and the other holds that GDP is the best indicator of our economic strength. In episode 2 of this series on the State of Australia in 2020, I took the position that improved well-being in an advanced country like Australia arises not so much from continued growth of GDP, but from fair sharing of national wealth and income. Economic growth isn't or shouldn't be an end in itself. It's how we share that growth that matters. But this is not to say that GDP growth isn't important. If an economy isn't growing or isn't growing fast enough, then there is certainly less wealth to share around, which will of course aggravate our troubles with inequality. So it stands to reason that if an elected government is embedding policies that are causing economic growth to slow down, then they're compounding our problems of inequality. In Australia today, we have a government that is doing exactly that, slowing our economy down. Well before the onset of COVID-19 and the recession brought on by the pandemic, Australians' economic growth was slowly declining. From the 1960s to the global financial crisis in 2008, Australia had been able to organise its economy to muster strong growth, something that shouldn't be too hard in such a rich, comparatively advanced and advantaged country. But since the GFC, and particularly since about 2014, with the election of the Conservative Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government, growth has slowed significantly. Since 2015, GDP growth has averaged 2.4% per annum, well below the average growth of 3.5% per annum achieved in Australia between 1961 and 2014. The structure of the Australian economy has stood it in good stead over the past 30 years, even during the global financial crisis. Because of some very nimble fiscal stimulus, Australia under the Rudd-Gillard government could still manage average annual growth in GDP of 2.6% throughout the GFC period, substantially better than the world average growth of 2.18% at the time. From 2014, however, the tables turned. Australia's GDP growth between 2014 and 2018 rose above world average growth only once, and then only very slightly. Otherwise, it tracked well below average world growth. And then, in 2019, it hit the rock bottom point of the previous 28-year period with annual growth of only 1.7%, worse than at any time since the 1991 global recession. And it hit this in a year when there was no global recession. On a per capita basis, the picture is rather worse for Australia, not better. During the Hawke, Keating and Howard government periods, Australia managed average annual GDP growth per capita above 2% per annum, even with the 1991 global recession. GDP per capita during the Howard government period was assisted by the mining boom and the rise of Asia as a new source of demand for Australia's exports. But since the global financial crisis of 2008, GDP per capita has grown at a slower pace, and since 2015, it has slowed to a snail's pace. In a country with Australia's natural resources, educated human capital, and brilliant international markets for its exports, there is simply no excuse for the 33% drop in the pace of per capita growth from 2015 onward, bearing in mind that in that period there were no global economic upheavals like the GFC or the 1991 global recession. If Australia settles for per capita GDP growth of less than 1% per annum for too much longer, the economy will simply not be able to carry as many Australians to prosperity as we've been accustomed to in the past. And of course, since the onset of COVID-19, GDP growth has gone into the negative, both in total and on a per capita basis. We might hope that this is a one-off temporary trough that we will emerge from as soon as the pandemic passes. But the prospects for that are not good, especially if we take the potential impact of climate change into account. For more information on the potential effect of climate change on Australia's economy, viewers may watch episode 6, part 2 of this series on the state of Australia in 2020, which covers our climate change policy options. But leaving our impending climate change troubles aside for the moment, let's look at the underlying strength of our economy and its ability to bounce back from the recession we're in now. In its 2020-2021 budget, the federal government is predicting a V-shaped recovery from the corona recession. They are predicting that in the 2020 calendar year, we will suffer a mere 3.75% drop in GDP and can expect to bounce back with a 4.25% growth in 2021. But the Australian Bureau of Statistics has recorded the fact that more than 7% has been wiped off our GDP in just the first 2 quarters of 2020. This means that the government has no basis for a rosy prediction of a mere 3.75% drop in the 2020 calendar year. But leaving that misleading budget spin aside, it is true that this massive fall in GDP is not the government's fault. Having said that, the pace at which Australia may recover from the recession brought on by COVID-19 is heavily dependent on the government's policy response from here on in. And it is patently obvious that it will no longer suffice to keep doing what we've been doing in our policy settings since 2014. All of those policies have been dragging our economy down. In May 2020, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, stated that we should remember that this event, these difficult times in 2020, were not caused by economic failure, but a global health pandemic. The problem was not the economy, he said. But these figures show clearly that the economy was a problem before COVID-19. At this point in our economy, the last thing we need is denial. The fact is that there is something seriously wrong in the structure of Australia's economy. In its current form, with its dependency on mining and exports, two sectors that are on the brink of big trouble if they're not already in big trouble, that economy has come to the end of its course, and current policy settings are actually making this worse, not better. To get this in perspective, we can look briefly at the history of Australia's economy, which we can describe in phases on a page. For about 80 years, from the 1880s to the 1960s, Australians enjoyed economic growth, as we like to say, off the sheep's back. And then we enjoyed growth into mining and manufacturing, supported by tariff protection policies for manufacturing and luck on high prices for our exports. We also benefited from immigration, which boosted economic growth and enabled us to develop a wage arbitration system which boosted family incomes. We controlled the economy to some extent by setting exchange rates administratively and regulating lending levels. From the 1960s to the early 1980s, though, that pre-war economy finally ran out of puff, with a reversal of Australia's terms of trade. Suddenly, our exports were earning less and our imports were costing more. Tariff protection had reduced our competitiveness in manufacturing, high wages had become unsupportable and inflationary, and rigidity in setting exchange rates and interest rates no longer functioned to shield us from the new price drops for our exports. But from the mid-1980s, the Australian economy was cleverly remade and strengthened by decisions to float the exchange rate, set interest rates outside politics, remove tariffs, and strike an accord between government and workers where wage restraint was agreed by unions in exchange for a strengthened welfare safety net. We also introduced enterprise bargaining with a focus on productivity increases in exchange for wage rises. Adding to that, we adopted national competition policy with a focus on level playing fields between the public sector and the private sector. And we successfully skilled up the government sector in profitable operation of its commercial trading enterprises. Finally, of course, information technology came along to allow Australia to expand the base of its exports. We shifted from simply selling commodities like minerals and started adding services to our export array, particularly in finance, education, and consulting services. We overcame the problems of distance from our markets. It was a busy time for some excellent reforms. Australia also got lucky in this period with the rise of China and India, both of which provided new sources of demand for Australia's commodities and which ushered in a mining boom that lasted for a decade until about 2012. But conversely, we hit bad luck with the September 11 attacks on America in 2001 and the Iraq War, into which we were thereafter improperly dragged. And we threatened our own economy by dismantling free tertiary education and stoking property price growth by a tax structure that encouraged investor speculation. The result of these two policy shifts was that millions of Australians became unable to afford a home and now start life with a debt for their education and fewer prospects of a decent job in the area for which they've acquired that debt. Then, of course, the GFC crashed in on that younger generation. But Australia adroitly responded to the crisis with fiscal stimulus, and we rode it out with a bit of extra luck because of our proximity to China and growing markets in Asia. We even laid the foundations of a new economy, one where energy would become cheaper and carbon permits could be sold due to the introduction of a price on carbon. So, from the mid-1980s to 2013, Australia's economy grew due to some very good luck and some very good management, a few mistakes about tertiary education, property prices, and entry into the Iraq War notwithstanding. But there, the good story has stopped. The economy of the previous 3 decades is now in decline and has been so since around 2014. Current policy settings are making this worse, not better. The policy settings from 2014 are very different to those at play before that. Since 2014, we've witnessed the arrival of full-blown neoliberalism, a policy which has reversed the cooperative fiscal and monetary approaches of the pre-2014 economy. In this reversal, we have threatened our economy by introducing austerity for the poorest and regressive taxation legislation. And we've seen the decline deepen because of a loss of the productivity focus in enterprise bargaining agreements, negative growth in new capital investment by the private sector, and a weakening of the competitive capacity of the public sector by poorly regulated privatisation of public assets, services, and government trading enterprises. The decline has then been accelerated because we have undermined environmental protection regulations, repealed the carbon price, increased subsidies for fossil fuels, and failed to develop a climate and energy policy. These policy settings are all running in precisely the opposite direction to that needed for an economy where one of our biggest exports, coal mining, is on the brink of decline, where demand has fallen for other key exports including education, where productivity has stalled, where private sector investment in new capital has stalled, where poverty is on the rise, where consumer demand and spending power are in decline, where environmental resources are being consumed at rates far beyond their capacity for renewal, where climate and energy policies are non-existent, and where there is no capacity left to reduce interest rates to help the economy along. Australians are probably used to hearing from the federal government that our economic fundamentals are strong, but they're not. These are just some of the weaknesses that are now afflicting our economy. The economic policies implemented since 2014 have not been working to expand our economy, and they will not work at any time in the foreseeable future. If Australians want to see a better report card than this one on the state of our economy in the next few years, a complete reversal of policies in multiple areas is required, particularly in taxation, welfare, government investment, government employment, labour relations, carbon emissions and pricing, energy, land use, social housing, and education. In the language of political economists, the reversal that is required is to the prevailing ideological tenets of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism hasn't done our economy any favours, and it has to go if we want to turn our economy around. Since 2014, Australia's economic policy and management has been dominated by neoliberalism. This is a political ideology which tells us that our well-being arises exclusively from economic growth, and that this growth can only arise from less government, less taxation, especially for the rich and for corporations, less public ownership and operation of assets and services, less welfare, less regulation of markets, and less regulation of use and pollution of the natural environment. Essentially, neoliberalism is unregulated capitalism. At its theoretical extreme, it gives capitalism a really bad name, especially insofar as it pursues a range of policies which can only result in growth in inequality. It embeds a system of socialism for the rich, but rugged individualism for the poor. It creates a new type of class structure in which those who earn more are judged in neoliberalism to deserve more. Those who earn less are assumed to be worth less. And those who are unable to get work are not entitled to the same rights as everyone else merely because they're not employed. They are assumed to be drains on an economy, not the vital sources of demand that they are for the services and the products that the rest of us want to continue to supply. Neoliberalism also results in national economies being smaller than they would otherwise be, because it withdraws the strength of the biggest single player in growing an economy. It withdraws the government sector from participation. By cramping public spending, government trading enterprises, and taxpayer participation in their own economy, neoliberalism unnecessarily reduces the size of the economy. Instead of freeing up taxpayer funds and giving taxpayers a say in how they would like to spend their own money and invest in themselves, neoliberalism encourages a transfer of the national revenue from the taxes paid by workers over to business owners and multinational corporations. Particularly in Australia's case, this results in massive taxpayer subsidies to mining companies. Australians are used to hearing about transfer payments to those on unemployment benefits, as though those transfer payments are a drag on the economy, not the stimulant that they are. But far bigger transfers are actually made to businesses. In the case of the fossil fuel subsidy, this transfer has grown to a disproportionately large figure. In fact, in 2015, the International Monetary Fund estimated that the subsidy provided by Australians to the fossil fuel industry had risen to an obscene $42 billion Australian, dwarfing the amount we provide in transfer payments to the sick and unemployed. In effect, before COVID-19, Australian taxpayers in total were witnessing their government set aside just under $14,000 a year for the welfare payments of each unemployed person. Imagine what it's like for an average person or family to live for a whole year on $14,000. But before COVID-19, while our government was imposing this penury on the poorest, they were also effectively setting aside the equivalent of $730,000 for each person employed in coal mining and oil and gas production. A subsidy like that might be considered reasonable if it enhances GDP by more than the subsidy. And indeed, Australia does earn more in gross terms from fossil fuel exports than it costs taxpayers in the subsidy. But the profits from these exports have gone to shareholders in industries that are fundamentally uncompetitive and environmentally destructive. The mining industry doesn't refund the subsidy to Australians when they make profits. They don't return it as a dividend. They keep it and work out all sorts of ways to avoid tax on the profits too. The fact is, Australians pay for all the profits and more for fossil fuel companies. Fossil fuel companies don't make any profit at all from genuine positive commercial trading. Brilliant commercial business people, they are not. They conduct these businesses at a loss and rely on Australians to pay their profits. Taxpayers' returns on any investment in fossil fuels have also been pushed even further into the negative, not least by the fact that, as taxpayers, we are retaining costs of remediation and climate change adaptation. And we're taking on upfront risk, because in the main, we're not receiving resources rents. To rub salt into the wound, the fossil fuel subsidy has had the effect of driving up domestic prices for electricity and gas, and any wealth arising from the industry hasn't been shared with Australians through wage rises or job creation. On the contrary, the jobs market has slowed in fossil fuels. As such, the subsidy for this dying industry is extremely unlikely to be making Australians or their economy better off. We would stimulate the economy far more effectively if we took just a quarter of this subsidy away from fossil fuels, where it is providing us with no extra jobs whatsoever, and used it to permanently double the job seeker payment to the unemployed, who would then spend it in Australia and stimulate demand for the things that the rest of Australians want to sell. This, of course, would raise prices for our coal and gas exports, which would make them less competitive in international markets. But when all the costs of producing coal and gas here are taken into account, they're not export competitive anyway. If they were, they wouldn't need the subsidy. Nationally, we'd be better off simply leaving them in the ground and subsidising instead our transformation into a renewable energy superpower. And if we took just another tiny fraction of this subsidy, 4%, we could put it to far better use by expanding public sector employment. For instance, instead of cutting 21,000 public sector jobs in universities, something that the current government is embedding by refusing to assist this sector through COVID-19, we could take a mere 4% of the fossil fuel subsidy and use it to recover the tertiary education sector and save these people and their families from the breadline. We would thereby be investing in an industry, education, with a proven record of contributing significantly and enduringly to Australian economic and cultural well-being. As Deloitte Access Economics reported in 2015, investment in university education, which the current federal government seems intent on destroying, provides socio-economic benefits well beyond those who actually obtain that education. In some cases, and especially in research, it is broader society that is by far the greatest beneficiary. Deloitte calculated that in 2014, the value accruing to Australia's total productive capacity due to tertiary education was $140 billion, of which only $24 billion accrued to the tertiary educated themselves. The spillover effects, it found, meant that for every 1 percentage point increase in the number of workers with a university degree, the wages of those without tertiary qualifications rose 1.6 to 1.9%. That's a far bigger contribution to wages growth per dollar invested than the current government has managed with its investment in fossil fuels since 2014. From a wages growth point of view, the fossil fuel subsidy is a negative investment. It dampens wages growth. In contrast, it is obviously in the interest of every Australian to make sure that the university sector is expanding to meet demand. Unfortunately, in post-COVID-19 Australia, the federal government is incapacitating our education industry and devoting attention instead to increasing the fossil fuel subsidy. This needs to be reversed. In fact, there is a myriad of better things Australians could do with the money being pumped into propping up fossil fuel companies. The fossil fuel subsidy is probably the pinnacle of all that is destructive about neoliberalism, at least in the Australian version of neoliberalism. But it is only one part of this unworkable economic policy approach. Australians are fortunate enough to be able to stand back and see the destruction that can be caused by fully unleashed neoliberalism. We only have to look at how it has failed in the United Kingdom and the USA. Economic policy in the UK and US has been largely steeped in neoliberalism since the 1980s, following the policies of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, policies which Australia's own Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg nostalgically venerated in July 2020 as fit to inspire our economic recovery from COVID-19. The neoliberal policies Mr. Frydenberg is fond of are about less competition, not more. More state subsidy to business, not partnership between workers and business owners. They're about corralling scarce natural resources for the few, not the many. Concentration of wealth in the hands of corporations, leaving everyone else to fend for themselves unassisted. Selling off public assets to private interests for far less than their real value. And they're about concentration of market power in private monopolies and oligopolies, particularly the private media duopoly of Murdoch and Nine News. These policies are also about flattened wages, flattened superannuation, resentment of industry super funds, and rejection of their members' growing influence in shareholder meetings. They are policies of austerity, policies which require the poor to do all the heavy lifting in the economy and the rich to do none at all. 40 years of neoliberal policies in the UK and the US have proved they don't work. The perversity of neoliberalism is that it performs poorly in growing economies, as we can plainly see if we look at the track record of growth in GDP in the UK over the last 6 decades and in the USA. In every decade since the 1960s, Neoliberalism has done nowhere near as much for the economies of the UK and the US as the strong government participation involving stimulus and full employment did in the post-war period. It simply sent the economies of the UK and the US into a trend of slow, and sometimes not so slow, decline. Luckily for Australia, full-blown neoliberalism only really took hold here from about 2014, but the effect has been similar. Once neoliberalism was allowed to dominate the policy agenda, our economy started to dive more steeply. Every policy setting in neoliberalism is running in the opposite direction to that necessary for sustained economic growth. Policies now embedded which have caused unnecessarily slow growth and which, if persisted with, will now unnecessarily prolong the decline of Australia's economy include artificial capping of government sector participation by adoption of an arbitrary tax to GDP cap of 23.9%, a cap which has no basis in economics and which simply caps what Australians can raise in taxation revenues to spend on themselves. And matching that, not surprisingly, we have suffered significantly slowed spending by government as both a proportion of GDP and on a per capita basis. In the 20 years to 2012, growth in real government spending per capita averaged 2.6% per annum, and our economy grew in that period. By contrast, from 2013, spending per capita declined on average, and our economy slowed significantly. Put simply, the government isn't spending enough to grow the economy, and neoliberalism is stomping all over our right to spend our own money on ourselves and sucking our money away to transfer it to a privileged few. Many Australians who have been taught to think that taxation and government spending are bad things may instinctively support strategies which cap government spending. But spending by governments pumps spending power for consumers into the economy, which is what makes it grow. Spending wisely is desirable, obviously. Efficiency in government is desirable, obviously. But reduced government spending in total is not wise at all. Government makes up a quarter of the size of Australia's economy. It's the biggest single player. So reducing the size of government can have only one effect, an economy that is smaller and can carry fewer Australians to a decent quality of life. As the government sector has started spending less and less since 2014, so growth in our total economy has slowed. A brilliant economy requires growth of both the public and private sector. It doesn't arise from reducing the participation of taxpayers and the taxpayer-owned sector. It doesn't arise from reducing taxpayers' ability to pool their funds either by taxes or by superannuation contributions and to buy things with those pooled funds that they could never afford as individuals. In Australia's case, success in the switch to a new economy involves some very simple choices, simple 180-degree reversals of the coalition government's current policies. Existing neoliberal policies are reducing GDP growth and increasing inequality. Direct policy reversals will increase GDP growth and reduce inequality. So, we can either continue artificially capping government and taxpayer participation in our own economy. In other words, we can reduce the money we bank for ourselves from our taxation revenues, or we can pool our taxation funds and spend it on ourselves instead of on foreign-owned companies. We can continue with the regressive tax cuts we have legislated, which significantly reduce tax for a small number of the very wealthy and increase average tax for the rest of Australians. For the truth about how recently legislated tax cuts will increase average tax for the lowest 80% of Australian workers, viewers may wish to view episode 2 in this series on the state of Australia. Alternatively, we have an option whereby we can repeal those tax cuts and ensure a much fairer system than one which, if left in place, will, by 2024, see people on low incomes of $45,000 pay the same marginal tax rate as those earning 4 times as much as they do. Scott Morrison has himself effectively admitted that, due to coronavirus, we can no longer afford these tax cuts. He has stated that the stimulus for coronavirus, at a direct cost of more than $150 billion in just the first 6 months of the pandemic, has all been borrowed, all of it, he says, against future tax revenue. That new borrowing ballooned out to $314 billion by October 2020. So, logically, the income tax revenue we told ourselves we wouldn't need, we are now more in need of than ever. And the truth is, we were always in need of it to fund our services. In times like these, we really have to change our attitudes to tax. Scott Morrison should listen to what more and more Australians have begun to say on this, because in 2020, commentators and analysts like the Australia Institute are correct. Tax is good. Tax is an investment in ourselves that we should be given full opportunity to make as a society acting together. And as we rip away at our tax revenues and make our whole tax system more and more unfair, we will rip our services to pieces. We may think we're better off with this tax in our pockets, but tax cuts, which both sides of politics rush to give us, are really just an attempt to bribe us with our own money. Tax cuts make Australians fund their own wage rises and let our employers escape sharing the profits we generate for them. But we do have other choices we can make to restructure and strengthen our economy. We can stand by and lose the tertiary education export sector, which used to bring in $39 billion annually in export income before COVID-19, and we can stand by and lose more than 20,000 jobs in that sector. Or we can say that this is entirely unnecessary and simply fund the sector to the full tune of demand and stimulate domestic demand by eliminating all tertiary education fees for our kids, instead of increasing some fees by margins designed to discourage enrolments. Other countries, like Germany, offer free tertiary education. Why not us? We can reduce job seeker payments back to where they were before COVID-19 and watch our economy plunge off a cliff because of the consequent massive drop in consumption, consumer confidence and consignment of more than 1 million extra Australians to life below the poverty line. We can add 1 million more people to the 3.2 million people who lived there below the poverty line before COVID-19. Or we can simply double the job seeker payment permanently. People on it would still be living only just above the poverty line and well below the median wage, but it would function as a significant stimulus to spending, and landlords with investment properties would have a much better chance of getting their rents. Of course, there are those who will protest that we could never afford to double JobSeeker. But JobSeeker and sickness benefits combined consumed just on 2% of our pre-COVID-19 federal budget. This could be doubled with no cost to the budget, simply by reducing the $42 billion subsidy taxpayers give to the fossil fuel industry every year by a mere $10 billion. In that arrangement, this $10 billion injection would boost our economy by being spent in Australia, instead of being dragged offshore for the benefit of foreign owners of polluting corporations. But even if we didn't dock the fossil fuel subsidy, we could still double JobSeeker with no impact on the federal budget. This is because, as Deloitte Access Economics has found, the boost to nominal GDP from increasing JobSeeker roughly equals the direct cost to the federal government of increasing the allowances. In other words, if we boost JobSeeker, we get it all back. We all get to share in the benefits. Boosting JobSeeker would fund itself. And then, of course, in health, we could continue deliberately setting increases in funding at levels lower than the known increases in demand, a strategy openly adopted by the Abbott government in its 2015 Intergenerational Report. In this report, the then Treasurer, Joe Hockey, disclosed that Australians would need to be spending 7.1% of their GDP on their health by 2055. But Mr. Hockey stated that spending will be capped at well below that level. This tightening of our health funding is proceeding apace in successive federal budgets. Alternatively, we can recognise the health and welfare sector as the colossus of jobs growth that it is, and fund our future well-being instead of our future ill health. We can stop, if we like, the excellent trend of expansion in renewable power we have witnessed over the last decade, an expansion which has established cheap, clean power for Australians and businesses, or we can simply stop buying high-priced, dirty power. We can also earn money from pricing carbon, or we can lose all hope of trading in carbon by pinning our hopes on the current government's preference for development of carbon sequestration technology that nobody wants to invest in because it's simply far cheaper not to use fossil fuels at all. We can waste taxpayer money subsidising building works for the tiny few who can afford expensive renovations and who were going to do their renovations anyway, or we can rapidly expand jobs by subsidising energy efficiency works in existing and new buildings. We can support people doing renovations, but for works on energy efficiency, which give returns on investment for everyone. We can continue refusing to provide a safe roof over everyone's head, and we can refuse them autonomy over their own lives by imposition of more and more pointless and discriminatory conditions on welfare. Or we can create massive employment by building homes for everyone, and in the process stop racking up bills for mental health, policing, prisons and out-of-home care for children. Bills we can avoid if we provide homes and early intervention support, particularly for Indigenous Australians whose families are being broken up by the current system. And we can continue to pay low wages to people who work in the vital services of teaching, nursing, childcare, aged care, cleaning and health support. Or we can value these workers, who are mainly women, and in the same action assist them to build decent superannuation balances. These are all no-brainers, these things on the green side of the page. We are being told we can't afford them, but the reality is that the thing we and our economy can't afford is the current government policies, those things on the left-hand side of the page. At this stage in 2020, Australians are free to choose whatever they like from either side of the menu here. We're free to decide about how, as our old economy dies, we might best set up a new economy. And we can organise to do that within a decision-making framework that we ourselves establish. As Australians together, we can look out towards the future we want to create and describe that in a vision. We can describe the directions we want to take towards whatever that vision is and the paths we want to avoid. Once we have that, we can then select from either side of the economic menu, according to whatever we think is most likely to get us towards the vision via our preferred paths. It's entirely possible for us to organise ourselves to do this. And we can make our choices before we have done so much damage to our economy that we can't recover. At the moment, we can observe that the left-hand menu hasn't worked for most Australians. If it had, we wouldn't be experiencing slow and negative growth and a rise in inequality. All the evidence at the moment is that if we do exactly the opposite of the policies that have swung into dominance under Australia's late shift to neoliberalism, we can swing the economy onto a new footing of sustainable growth. The good news for Australia is that our economy has not yet slipped into a serious state as, say, Britain's. And all the evidence about what can cause decline in capitalist economies like Australia's is now clear for us to observe before it's too late. Even with COVID-19, we haven't yet seen our economy plunge fully off the cliff, although with COVID-19 it has taken a terrible blow on top of the blows inflicted by neoliberalism. We've taken a big fall, but there is still time to avoid an even deeper plunge if we choose to apply some simple, decent rules of thumb that are consistent with the fair go we have always valued. These rules of thumb are essential guidelines as Australians begin to plan a better future for their economy, their environment, and their cohesion as a society. These guidelines include a recognition that if a policy sounds mean and unfair, it is likely to crush consumer spending, the thing our economy relies on most. So, unfairness, exclusion, and reduction of welfare payments should be avoided, just as it has been in Australia until recently. If a policy sounds like something done to advantage the already privileged or extremely big business, it is likely to dispose of national wealth, assets and services to those with inordinate market power and to discourage competition, the thing we rely on most to ensure efficiency and sustainable consumption of scarce resources. If a policy sounds like it rejects the weight of evidence of the sciences, it is likely to turn Australia into a backwater, a back-of-the-field player in the globalised economy. If it sounds like it might discourage investment in sustainable industries or make education less accessible, it is likely to cost jobs and will reduce productivity. If it sounds like it puts self-interest before the national interest, it's likely to destroy capitalism rather than make it work for everyone. In 2020, there is nothing good to report about the state of Australia's economy. Even so, it's not too late to rescue it. If we want to see a happier report in a couple of years, the lessons are pretty clear. One key lesson, though, is to make sure the government sector of Australia's economy retains its competitive capacity, particularly its capacity to capitalise on a natural advantage, the advantage of taxpayer ownership of assets and services. Australia has lost a lot of that advantage in the past couple of decades. In the next section, I'll provide some insights into that loss and its impact on our economy. This is a loss we have to at least suspend or reverse if we can, if we want to recover from COVID-19 quickly and avoid the full plunge off the cliff. Stay tuned for the next issue. Issue 13, Lost Public Ownership. Over the last 3 decades, Australians have witnessed a massive sell-off of publicly owned assets, services and government commercial trading enterprises, or GTEs. We've written ourselves out of ownership of ports, airports, an airline, toll roads, buses, electricity generation and transmission infrastructure, a very big bank, a commercial health insurer, commercial laboratories, vital databases, and too many other vital assets and services to mention. Massive money-making businesses for the nation have been sold off. In some cases, we've even written ourselves out of this ownership by entering deals detrimental to the assets and services that we've retained, such as deals in which the port in Sydney was sold with promises to restrain future competition from the competing ports, such as Newcastle. In other words, these things are frequently sold in a manner that reduces competition, and this results in price rises. 30 years of this behaviour has led the chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, Rod Sims, to come out and say he has lost faith in privatisation and deregulation, a program for which he was once a keen supporter. In 2016, Mr Sims reported to the Melbourne Economic Forum that "I'm now almost to the point of opposing privatisation because it's been done to boost proceeds, it's been done to boost asset sales, and I think it's severely damaging to our economy." Yes, it is. But not only is it damaging to the economy, it is reducing returns to taxpayers, reducing their shares of wealth in their own economy. And it has come to this because of the way the privatisations have been administered. Originally, these privatisations were meant to occur in the context of the introduction of the National Competition Policy by the Hawke-Keating government. This was a policy which focused on ensuring a level playing field for public and private sector competitors in the market and protecting Australia against the anti-competitive behaviour that occurs when private entities get too much market power. It was not the intention to unleash unregulated private monopolies onto the economy. The intention was to create competition and to skill up the public service in efficient and profitable operation of competitive government trading enterprises alongside private competitors. And for a while, it worked, with some public enterprises being corporatised and growing profits for the nation in the process. But as it played out, it eventually all went horribly wrong. Gradually, competition policy was effectively discarded. Governments abandoned efficiency programs for public sector enterprises, vacated competitive markets, and simply sold off these vital assets and enterprises, very often with little or no regulatory constraints. On the contrary, regulations were often loosened to allow a privileged few to make even more profits from assets and services that taxpayers had spent decades establishing. And remarkably, they were frequently sold off as monopolies, creating immense market power for a few lucky and, in most cases, inexperienced corporations. One of the more stark examples of this relates to the sale of the New South Wales Land and Property Information Service, the LPI. The New South Wales LPI is the service which houses all land title data in New South Wales and makes it possible for people to ensure they are buying and can retain a legitimate title to a property without threat of theft or financial loss from unregulated or illegal behaviour. The LPI was sold by the New South Wales Government in 2017, and I may as well introduce a spoiler here. It was sold for a fraction of its real worth. Prior to its sale, the LPI was earning $190 million a year, selling very cheap property title protection to New South Wales buyers and owners, and it was making $130 million a year in profit. That's a 68% profit for the taxpayer owners of this service in just that 1 year. On top of that, New South Wales property owners were paying next to nothing for transactions on titles and next to nothing on title insurance. But despite the public sector cleverness, which had transitioned the LPI from paper to digitised records, business improvements so successful that they had taken the business to the point of being able to generate 68% in profits each year for taxpayers, this GTE was sold without a publicly disclosed business case and sold as a monopoly, meaning there would be no downward pressure on future prices due to competition. The hefty profits we used to share were handed over to a tiny few. The contract included conditions that price increases for future transactions on titles must be kept at CPI. But this contract structure would do nothing other than create an incentive for the future operator to maximise profits by other means, by cutting costs instead. Costs of things that would protect the titles like staff oversight, cyber security, and cross-checking of limitations on titles, such as the fact that a property might be subject to compulsory acquisition for future road construction or might be on a floodplain. The imposition of the CPI cap on future price increases chargeable by the successful buyer of the LPI also had the effect of reducing the sale price for the LPI. The New South Wales Government sold the LPI for 35 years for a mere $2.6 billion. It also gave away the growth in the business that would have come to taxpayers from the addition of another 1.8 million new titles predicted to arise from population growth and construction during the 35-year life of the contract. So, every time we or our children buy a home on a new title, we will now be gifting the additional value of that title to the new private owner of the LPI and all the future profit that will come from transactions on those new titles. Additionally, the state government retained title insurance costs, so we didn't even get to offload that to the buyer. This is insurance we will need to pay a lot more for now because the risk of title fraud, outright title theft, and administrative failure has been markedly increased by the sale. This risk was exemplified by the fact that when the sale was announced and 70 LPI staff were made redundant, administrative errors started occurring where they never had before. One of these resulted in over 200 families unknowingly buying properties in the path of a future freeway. Ostensibly, all this was necessary to finance the rebuilding of 2 Sydney football stadiums that didn't actually need rebuilding. But had the New South Wales government retained the LPI in public ownership, it would have generated the $2.6 billion sale price in only 19 of the 35 years of the contract. And after 19 years, New South Wales taxpayers would have continued to be able to net a minimum of another $5 billion in earnings, not counting the additional revenue that would have been generated from the 1.8 million future additional titles. We lost that $5 billion and more. The sale cost us at least twice what we got from it. All up, it would have been far cheaper and generated far more returns to taxpayers simply to borrow the $2.6 billion for the stadiums, if indeed they were necessary. Interest on a loan over 15 years at, say, 3% would have cost us less than $1 billion, but taxpayers were forced to forego a minimum of $5 billion due to the sale. In other words, the LPI was sold for well less than half its value. The sale was nothing more than a facilitated raid on one of the most important assets for the state to retain in the public interest. It was theft, legal theft, but still theft. Nobody, not even the Real Estate Institute and real estate agents, had a good word to say about this sale at the time. It's far too hard to assess whether the sale of the LPI is typical of the handling of so many other sales of public assets and services over recent decades. But for as long as the public does not have access to or oversight of business cases and contract conditions on these sales, it should be assumed that the LPI sale is typical and that extraordinarily profitable assets such as ports and airports are sold at a loss to the public. These assets are hoovered up by private investors precisely because they make extraordinary profits. For that reason, they should not be sold unless there is an absolutely transparent business case that can be independently assessed to prove that it is in the public interest and will not result in reduced competition. Until that happens, it's not going to be possible to provide a good report about the state of Australia's capacity to ensure an efficient economy. Some Australians will argue that privatisation of these assets allows them to buy back into the profits by direct investment as shareholders or through their superannuation. And there is a sense in which this is true. Thanks to the introduction of compulsory superannuation by the Hawke-Keating government, millions of Australians have been catapulted into a position of holding, in aggregate, more than $2.9 trillion in savings that are generating investment growth for the nation and returns for those workers. But public assets didn't need to be sold to facilitate that. We could have and should have retained the potential for returns from our invested taxes alongside the new returns from investment of our superannuation. Australians should be able to use both their pooled funds from taxation and their pooled superannuation funds to maximise the shares of Australia owned by Australians and minimise the shares owned by a few private, mostly foreign-owned and unaccountable entities. But for over 20 years, federal and state policies have been shrinking the shares of Australia owned by ordinary Australians. All of this has come about because Australians have been persuaded that taxation is bad, that it's a kind of theft instead of a simple way of pooling funds so that Australians can invest more and more in Australians. And it has occurred because we have made an assumption that the public sector is inherently less efficient and less capable than the private sector. But as we've seen in episode 2, this is quite unlikely to be true. After all, the private sector now boasts of sweeping up 85% of Australia's workers, but it uses them so inefficiently that they produce only 75% of the GDP. The public sector provides work for the other 15% of employed Australians, but they produce 25% of the GDP. None of that attests to the comparative efficiency of the private sector. What is apparent, though, is that as we've sold off more and more public assets over the last couple of decades to private operators, we've not seen an increase in productivity. We haven't seen an increase in our production and outputs per hour of work. We've seen a trend of decline. Again, this is no testimony to the notion that as we hand over more public assets to the private sector, productivity and efficiency will increase. If they will, we're still waiting. The truth is that both sectors, public and private, face the same challenges, and in any sensible arrangement should be given the same opportunities on a level playing field to grow their contribution to a modern economy. At the moment, we are hamstringing the public sector to favour the private sector. We may think this will work well for our individual shares of the nation's wealth. We may think that while we have sold off our tiny share of a public asset, that we have nevertheless enabled ourselves to buy back into a bigger share of that and the profit from it via our superannuation. But the operative word here is buy. We have to buy into the new private companies to get the profits we used to command for a much smaller investment. That makes us no better off. We have simply stopped devoting the tiny amount of tax we used to pay for a share in the public asset and risked more of our own money, sometimes the entirety of the capital we have spent a lifetime building, for a tiny share in the newly privatised and then often badly run asset. It's like paying twice for the asset and a share of returns which may never materialise. And a vast amount of the profits we used to reap from public enterprises and plough back into public services for ourselves are now largely sent offshore. On top of that, we have individually taken on a far bigger share of the risk of poor management of the privatised asset. Financially, this makes no sense. This is the point we have reached after 30 years of sales of public assets. We are wealthy still, but nowhere near as wealthy as we would have been if we had stuck with the original national competition policy and simply used the brains of Australians to make the public sector GTEs competitive with the private sector. In some states, such as New South Wales, the government is signalling a preference for financing the state's future by more asset sales, including the possibility of the sale of TAFE. There is less threat in 2020 that government properties will be sold due to a serious drop in property prices, but services such as TAFE are very much at risk. And given that we've engaged in divestment of public assets on such a large scale, it is logical to ask, are we better off by backing out of just about every one of our own assets and services and buying in only to private corporations? Are we worse off? If inequality is a measure, we would have to say more of us are worse off than better off. And if increased corporate profits but reduced growth in GDP and wages is a measure, then we would have to say we're worse off. And if price increases are the result of sell-offs of assets like electricity generation, toll roads and property title data, then we would have to say we're worse off. Sell-offs of taxpayer-owned assets and services have resulted in increased prices, costs, risks and liability for taxpayers, reduced competition, reduced efficiency and productivity, increased market concentration, reduced accountability, diminished national wealth and diminished sharing of national wealth. It's not a good report card. It may be theorised that there is nothing inherently good or bad about privatisation of public assets, as long as we can see what's going on and assure ourselves it is being done well and done in a manner that improves efficiency by increasing, not decreasing, competition. But the minute we sell these things, we lose all claim to accountability from the buyer. Continuing sell-offs without the clarity of a decent business case and transparent contract conditions can only add new losses to old ones and perpetuate a system in what used to be owned by all of us without exclusion is consigned into the hands of a few corporate entities who generally have few or no proven credentials in competency and who have neither the nation's nor our individual interests at heart. This situation has been exacerbated by the neoliberal zeal for deregulation, which has seen unrestrained corporations willing to exploit Australian citizens in the most unconscionable ways, purely in order to maximise their own profits. Examples abound, including the banking sector, the aged care sector, and the private tertiary education sector. Privatisation of public assets and services has been a failure in Australia, and all the evidence is that it is too risky to assume competency in private sector operators of public services. And if the big corporate players, those who seem to be most influential in government post-COVID-19, are anything to go by, we can only expect that the less capable of these corporations will seek, by lobbying, which is anything but transparent, to ensure they can continue to run businesses at massive losses which they will make Australian taxpayers pay for. Business competency is not something we can be assured of in those who have bought our energy assets over the years and who are now seeking increased taxpayer subsidies for ventures which have no place in Australia's future. I'm speaking, of course, of the gas and mining corporations who are currently doing their best to drag Australia back to the dark ages of an economy based on fossil fuels. Australia's economy is on the brink of collapse and needs to be newly made by a rapid shift to decarbonisation, alongside a significant expansion of public sector employment in health, welfare and education, a diversification of our industrial base, and an inclusive industrial relations system. This is the minimum required for a better report card next time round, and yet we are suffering an inertia in all these things. In the rest of this episode, I'll cover the economic disaster awaiting Australia because it has fallen into inertia in its transition to decarbonisation. Subsequent episodes will expand on this and the other rapid shifts we need to make to establish Australia's new economy before the old one collapses completely. Stay tuned for issue 14 on inertia in transition to a decarbonised economy. Given Australia's abundant resources of sunlight and open land and our need to avert the more disastrous effects of climate change, it is inevitable that the renewable energy industry will expand to become a mainstay of Australia's economy and jobs market. And yet, the federal government of Australia in 2020 has backed what it calls a gas-led recovery from the COVID-19 recession, to the almost complete neglect of the renewable energy sector, the sector that is far more likely to provide secure and safe jobs for Australians. In 2020, the renewable energy industry employs more than 25,000 people due to the establishment in 2001 of the Renewable Energy Target. This target required energy companies to move towards sourcing 23% of electricity from clean renewable sources. The target has since resulted in significant investment in large-scale renewable energy generation capacity. But when the target was finally reached in 2019, the Australian government refused to raise it beyond 23%. This inaction triggered a sudden 50% drop in large-scale renewable energy investment compared with 2018. Just at the time we should be increasing such investment, if only due to the fact that the market for fossil fuels is set inevitably to decline, and renewables are now a cheaper source of power in Australia than coal and gas. It is well established that if Australia increased its renewable energy target from 23% to 50% by 2030, this would lead to the creation of far more jobs than will be lost in the inevitable and impending demise of thermal coal. Climate Council studies show that job losses in coal-fired electricity generation would be more than compensated for by increased employment in the renewable energy sector. In fact, net additional jobs would be created in all states. The biggest net increases would be in the states currently supporting the largest number of coal mining jobs, Queensland and New South Wales. In job terms, those states would be substantially net better off. They would have stronger economies with no thermal coal mining and a full shift to renewable energy. And yet, state policies, particularly on royalties, are skewed to support coal mining, and at the federal level, the Morrison government seems intent on a fossil fuel-led recovery from the economic crisis brought on by COVID-19, even though renewables are cheaper, and even though, with adjunct battery storage and pumped hydro, we're fully able to provide continuity of power supply throughout the day and the year. The policy settings encouraging coal and discouraging renewables are therefore all upside down from both an economy and a jobs point of view, not just from an environmental point of view. They are a mark of serious incompetence in economic management and downright perversity in relation to job creation. While asserting that its focus is on jobs, the Morrison government has, contrary to Australia's best interests, selected an economy based on expensive carbon-emitting fuels which provide far less jobs than clean renewables. Renewable energy will be a major source of jobs in the next few years. Coal and gas will not. Robotisation has been reducing jobs in coal mining since the end of the mining boom. And since neither a new mining boom and good prices for coal are likely in any scenario, this trend of decline in coal mining jobs will be ongoing, notwithstanding the protestations by both the Liberal National Coalition government and the Labor Party. Both these political parties are asserting that coal will be part of our future for decades to come, but it is set to be a smaller and smaller part, no matter what any politician may say. Australia's future is instead undoubtedly in renewable energy, but there are very different possible outcomes for jobs in renewables depending on the government's COVID-19 stimulus measures and its wider energy policies. Recent studies by the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, have demonstrated that if policies are set to signal a future for renewables, the renewable energy industry could create 20,000 extra jobs in the next 5 years, increasing the total jobs from the current 25,000 to 45,000. But if no additional policies are provided to incentivise investment in renewables, either by large-scale generators or households and businesses, then jobs will drop by 11,000 down to 14,000 by 2022. None of that drop would be offset by coal industry jobs growth, because that industry is employing less and less, even with new mines. Policy settings that would produce such a drop would obviously be contrary to the national interest. Australia is poised to be a renewable energy superpower, but we have a government intent on sticking with a declining and destructive basis in our economy, coal and gas. This applies to both the government and the Labor opposition. Both are acting contrary to the obvious national interests here. The scenario of 45,000 jobs by 2025 has been put forward by the Australian Energy Market Operator, based on a step-change investment pattern in renewables that would be necessary for Australia to meet commitments it has made under the Paris Agreement on climate change. The Paris Agreement has been signed by 197 countries, including Australia. It means we have committed to reducing emissions from fossil fuels in order to limit global heating to 2 degrees Celsius and preferably cap the heating to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial revolution levels. Meeting these goals would be a win-win-win for Australia, reducing our carbon emissions, restoring our tattered international reputation as a good faith negotiator, and generating far more jobs than those likely to be lost in the decline of coal mining and other fossil fuels. But still, everything about current energy policy in Australia is set contrary to the public interest and wholly in favour of Australia's inordinately powerful mining lobby. If you'd like to know more about just how damaging this is to Australia's economy, you can view Episode 6, Part 2 in this series on the state of Australia in 2020 on climate policy failure. Outside the mining lobby, in 2020, Australia does have some business groups, energy industry operators, unions and major investors who support renewables and are calling for reintroduction of a price on carbon. It has taken big business groups, including farmers and peak bodies like the Australian Industry Group, 6 years since they pressured the Parliament of Australia to scrap the carbon price in 2014 to figure out that the carbon price should not have been scrapped, that it should not have been demonised as though it is a tax, when in fact it will make money for Australia. That's 6 crucial years to admit that reintroduction of a price on carbon would enable Australia to make much more money from being green than it can ever make from being brown. It has taken them 6 years to figure out that domestically and in exports they could have been making money from a carbon price all along, and that we have sacrificed a strong influential position in international carbon markets in exchange for a much smaller benefit for a few coal mining magnates. As the CSIRO and National Australia Bank have pointed out in the Australian National Outlook 2019, a switch to carbon trading in the agricultural sector alone would reap strong economic benefits. Carbon sequestered in forests could be produced profitably on over 30 million hectares, equivalent to half or more of the marginal agricultural land in Australia's intensive use zone. Supported by higher carbon price assumptions, planting on this scale means that returns to landowners could more than double to as much as $114 billion per annum, growing land use industries as a share of national GDP from 2.1% to 5.2% by 2060. This has the added benefit of directly supporting jobs and incomes in regional Australia. With a carbon price, Australia could look forward to excellent prices and income to be gained for the nation, and particularly for its farmers, merely for planting trees on land not useful for food and fibre production. Our landowners in rural and regional Australia could see their share of GDP grow by more than double, and prices for their carbon trading double over the next generation. But instead, everything in policy is set to bank our future on a commodity for which prices are dropping, and are bound to drop even further, and for which there is an environmental cost we will be unable to pay. Everything in Australian federal policy is set against pricing the thing we could sell domestically and internationally at very good prices: carbon permits. As Australia attempts to emerge from the economic recession that was already in play before coronavirus, federal policies are being set in 2020 to repeat the massive mistakes in economic management since 2014. We are being set up to repeat the mistakes that weakened our economy rather than prepared it for COVID-19. The mistakes that have sent us to the back of the field in the race to lead the world carbon market and the green energy market. Year after year, Australians are being put upon to subsidise fossil fuels by $42 billion per annum to keep the prices we can command for our exports of coal and gas low enough to compete with other suppliers. In other words, to allow us to dump our coal on international markets for less than it costs us to produce. Taxpayers are supplying the profits of the big mining companies in Australia, who cannot otherwise sell their fossil fuels at a profit. Taxpayers, not mining companies, are also paying the salaries of those employed in coal mining, which would be reasonable if Australia was achieving a net growth in its economy by that strategy, compared to what could be achieved by transitioning to clean jobs in renewable energy. But the days when subsidies for fossil fuels will produce a better return than investment in renewables are over. The federal government is championing a technology-led economic recovery in the energy sector. It is switching funds previously set aside for investment in renewables to use by fossil fuel companies in new gas infrastructure, coal mining underwriting, and development of carbon capture and storage technology, otherwise known as CCS. They hope that CCS will sequester fugitive emissions from coal mining and from fossil fuel use in industry and commerce. It's a vain hope, because the technology remains unproven and it is not favoured by industry. Nevertheless, the federal government has announced an intention to use the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA, to fund investment in development of CCS technology. This will increase the Australian $42 billion subsidy from taxpayers to the fossil fuel industry, with no quid pro quo in terms of reduced emissions. Based on past experience, the coal industry, and the gas industry for that matter, cannot be trusted with this money. To date, the fossil fuel industry has demonstrated no genuine interest in developing CCS, let alone in deploying it at scale, despite the fact that the government has thrown money at them for this purpose. As Professor Ross Garnaut, a renowned expert in this field, has observed, despite the commitment of large financial support from the Australian government, the Australian coal mining industry hardly invested at all in the research, development and commercialisation of CCS. And wider industrial and commercial traders have next to no interest in it either. For them, it's simply cheaper not to use fossil fuels at all. In summary, we have policies expanding massive subsidisation of an industry in which jobs are declining and which is providing no boost in the size of Australia's economy. Because of federal policy militating against a carbon price, Australia has set itself into losing more in GDP than it ever needed to in the transition to decarbonisation. As the Reserve Bank of Australia and 60 other central banks worldwide have reported, all countries are very likely to see their GDP fall because of climate change. If we limit global heating to 2 degrees Celsius, the fall in global GDP is likely to be 4% by 2100, meaning that in 80 years' time, the economy will not be one jot larger than it is now. It will be smaller, despite the passage of so much time. Imagine the pain endured in incessant cuts to the world's wealth over such a long period. However, this is the good news. The bad news is that if we do nothing to reverse our current policies before 2030, the global economy will be 10% smaller than it is now. And if we persist with current climate policy settings and our completely uncooperative behaviour internationally, and others follow suit, global GDP is likely to fall by 25%. The hardship brought on by such perverse behaviour is indescribable. Australia will not be immune from this. If global heating exceeds 2 degrees Celsius, Australia will heat by more than that because of its land mass. The Earth will heat more over land than it will over the oceans. But Australia could be one of the few countries that could avoid much, if not all, of this GDP loss because of our capacity to become a renewable energy superpower and to restructure our economy towards services instead of fossil fuels. We are well placed, better placed than many other countries, to transform impending economic losses into gains. For more information on the economic benefit of reversing current policy settings, viewers may wish to read Professor Ross Garnaut's recent book, Superpower, Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity. It provides practical optimism about Australia's economic future if we choose to decarbonise. And if we choose to take a stronger leadership role internationally in carbon emissions reduction, there is an even bigger economic opportunity for Australia, one that can ensure our recovery from the recession brought on by COVID-19 can be achieved swiftly. For more information on this, check out episode 6, part 2 on the state of Australia in 2020. The next episode, episode 6 of this series on the state of Australia in 2020, is about our environment, and it has 2 parts. In part 1, I look at how our natural environment, ecosystems and biodiversity are faring in 2020. Part 2 on climate change policy provides a practical set of opportunities that Australia can seize in addition to Ross Garnaut's renewable energy opportunities. If adopted, these additional strategies would help Australia to transform its whole economy inside the next 10 to 15 years, with nothing but benefit for Australians. Australians wishing to travel towards a brighter economic future can increase their chances of arriving there by melding these and other strategies for our society, environment and democracy into a coherent plan that will help us build the new economy we need more quickly than we could otherwise. Australia Together is being developed by Australians to ensure we can integrate our efforts along multiple lines and travel efficiently to a brighter future. You can become involved in developing Australia Together by visiting the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au and registering for updates. Thanks for watching this episode. For further episodes in this series of the State of Australia, visit the ACFP website at www.austcfp.com.au. If you like this episode, please click like on the YouTube page and share the episode with your friends and subscribe to this channel.